Hello, my name is Bill Fegis, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Business Transformation 101 podcast. Today's topic is how to interview for A players. The prior podcast focused on the people aspect of talent. This podcast will focus on the process aspect of talent. As noted in the Volume 1 podcast, we need to deploy processes in all aspects of the business to ensure sustainable and improving performance. A robust interviewing process will ensure that you are hiring A players. In the Volume 2 podcast, we discussed what defines an A player. The interviewing team is responsible for creating a scorecard along with the position specification that documents the goals that need to be achieved, along with the behavioral attributes required to be an A player for the position. During my career, I found that the interviewing practices in organizations are pretty much seat of the pants and generally lack a well-defined process. Hiring a new employee is one of the biggest investments we make, yet we spend little time interviewing the individual we are going to hire. I spend 3 to 4 hours interviewing a candidate utilizing a structured interview process, and I expect the other members of the interviewing team to do the same. For a direct report, this interview is in person and should also be in person for a position one level down. The COVID-19 pandemic has made in-person interviewing problematic, but I would recommend the hiring manager do the interview in person while observing the appropriate safety protocols. I've successfully used a structured interviewing approach that is based upon a process developed by Bradford D. Smart and documented in his book, Top Grading: How Leading Companies Win by Hiring, Coaching, and Keeping the Best People. And more importantly, from a subsequent book by Mr. Smart's son, Jeff Smart, entitled Who, the A Method for Hiring. The process is straightforward, but does take discipline and commitment to execute. There are no shortcuts. Studies put the success rate on new hires, defined as the employee was still employed 18 months after hiring, at 50% or lower. I estimate that this structured interview approach should push the interviewing success rate up to 75 to 80%. I recommend reading Who, the A Method for Hiring to get a good understanding of the structured interview process prior to implementing it in your business. Let's do a high-level review of the structured interview process. The first section of the interview is focusing on questions about the candidate's experience in high school, undergraduate, and graduate school. It consists of 3 questions for each period of schooling. The first is to discuss the top 3 points in their high school career, and then their undergraduate and graduate career. Second question is discuss the worst 3 low points in each of those school careers. And finally, what was your GPA in each of those 3 careers? These questions provide valuable perspectives on the candidate's behavioral attributes and can elicit some informative responses. Note that the high and low points do not have to be academic. They could be related to sports, social, family, clubs, activities, etc. In my experience, candidates are unaccustomed to discussing low points, and you may have to do more prompting with the interviewee to get good data on the low points. In the second section of the interview, you're really going to focus on their work career, and you're going to do that by walking through their resume chronologically and asking the following 5 questions for each position they have held. First question is, what were you hired to do in that position? What accomplishments are you most proud of during your time in that position? What were some low points during that job? Who were the people you worked for? This should include both the peers and the reporting team, as well as the supervisor. And finally, why did you leave the job? These top-level questions each have sub-questions to get more granular in obtaining a detailed response from the candidate. Refer to the book, Who, the A Method for Hiring, to learn more about these sub-questions. Going through these questions can be a laborious process, especially with more experienced candidates who have longer resumes. Adhering to the process will yield the data needed to make an effective assessment of the candidate. So don't shortcut each of the positions and the questions you apply in each of those. In the third section of the interview, there are 8 questions related to the interviewee's future career. First is, why are you interested in leaving your current position? Second is, what drives you? What is important to you as you look forward to the next opportunity? Third question, where do you want to take your career? What do you want to do long term? Fourth question is, what is compelling about this opportunity? What do you hope to accomplish? Fifth question, what concerns do you have about this position? Sixth question is, what will be the biggest challenge for you? Next to last question, how likely is it that you would take this job? And finally, is there anything else I should know? So you've gone through the 3 sections of the interview. Just like to take a moment to discuss the closing comments then that follow the interview. You want to give the candidate the opportunity to ask questions, and this can give you some sense of how interested they are in the position. Describe what happens next and offer them a timeline. Thank the candidate and end the interview. Pass the candidate to the HR or the next interviewer as previously planned. Immediately following the interview, you should analyze the candidate's responses to the interview, rate the scorecard using the data gathered during the interview, and return it back to HR and the interviewing team. A few key points to keep in mind while going through the interview questions, some suggestions. Listen, don't talk. Studies show that interviewers talk too much. I recommend the interviewer talk 20% or less of the time. Second, don't fill dead air. Sometimes it will take the interviewee time to respond to one of the questions. Don't jump in to fill the dead air. Let them answer in their own time. And finally, control the interview. Some candidates will have a tendency to move along to the next position on their resume before they have covered all 5 questions for that position. Pull them back and ensure to ask all 5 questions for each position. You want to make sure you remain in control of the interview and get all the data you need. A key part of the structured interview is to look for patterns in the candidate's responses. Is there something common in all of the positions? Was there improvement in identified developmental areas? How do these patterns fit with the goals and behavioral attributes specified for the position? One way to effectively analyze the interview responses is to summarize them in 2 T-charts. One T-chart is for performance relative to goals, and the other T-chart is performance relative to behavioral attributes. The 2 columns for each T-chart are meets or exceeds the spec and does not meet the spec. These are essentially pros and cons relative to the spec. And each column lists the specific response patterns from the interview in the appropriate column. Use these completed T-charts to assess the likelihood that this candidate would be successful in achieving the goals for the position while aligning with the company's culture, as was defined on the scorecard for the position. In summary, interviewing is a critical process to ensure getting the right people on the team. Each hire is a major investment, so take the time to create an effective interviewing process and hold the interviewing team accountable for utilizing that process. Here on the reference slide, we provide information on the books noted in the podcast. In the interest of continuous improvement, I invite feedback from our listeners. Please share your thoughts and ideas on these weekly podcasts and suggest topics that would provide useful information to our listeners. In our next podcast, we will be talking about people again, and this time we're going to talk about a robust talent acquisition process, which will include the steps beyond interviewing. Thank you for spending your time listening to our podcast, and we hope you join us for the next one.